Hi, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 12. The issues that make up the content of this chapter constitute the basic fabric of everyday moral life, cutting across our public and our private lives. All of us will have at least some experience with one of these topics. Quickly, before we move on, I just want to go ahead and define and fill in some details about the four topics that are covered in this chapter. First, we have lying, and the definition of lying as used by the author of our book is to intentionally deceive through one's actions. And there are different kinds of lies. One type is the white lie, which is to intentionally deceive without the intent to injure and without significant moral consequences. Then we have lies of commission, or kind of active lies, which is when we intentionally make or state some falsehood. And then we have lies of omission, which is to intentionally leave out relevant information with the intent to deceive. Next, we have cheating, which is to deceive by acting in a dishonest manner, or to deceive by trickery, or to practice fraud. Next, we have to promise, and here the moral failing is to break a promise. But by promise, we mean a vow or a declaration that someone will do something. And then lastly, we have stealing, which is the wrongful taking of another's property. And that is broken down into grand larceny and petty larceny. So as we've been moving through the book, we keep coming back to consequentialist views and non-consequentialist views. So first I want to take on the rule non-consequentialist views as it pertains to these four issues: lying, cheating, promise breaking, and stealing. So of course the rule non-consequentialist is going to be opposed to all four of these acts. Kant, for example, would argue that the acts cannot be universalized, and that any one of these acts is really a way of using people as a means. So of course it violates the good old categorical imperative. Additionally, lying and cheating are wrong. They are viewed as next to worst immoralities, and they bring about disgrace to the perpetrator. Now, a consequentialist or an act non-consequentialist are going to have slightly different takes on these four transgressions. An act non-consequentialist may feel like lying at one time is acceptable, but that lying at some other time is not acceptable. The gist here is that their position will change based on the exact circumstances and the way that they feel. Consequentialists are going to say that these four acts may or may not be justifiable depending on, of course, the perceived consequences. Now, an ethical egoist would do any of these four acts if it's in their best interest. An act utilitarian will lie if the consequences are good, and a rule utilitarian will probably have rules against all four of these types of acts. And remember that rule utilitarians kind of seem to be leaning a little bit more actually toward non-consequentialist views, and so that seems right in line with the rule utilitarian overall framework. Recipients of lying, cheating, stealing, and promise breaking will of course feel disappointed and resentful, angry, upset, and may have trouble trusting others in the future. Okay, let's focus on our first act, which is lying. Some arguments against lying are, of course, that it dupes or deceives others. It also, secondly, it causes distrust in human relationships. So lying can cause a breakdown of relationships. It can cause resentment and suspicion. And frequently we've seen that relationships are broken when the honesty is destroyed. Third reason against, or an argument against lying, is what's called the domino effect, or the domino argument. The idea here is that what we do in any given situation may lead to additional problems. One lie tends to beget others in order to maintain the first lie. And so kind of lying breeds more lying. And then, of course, liars sometimes, depending on kind of how in the weeds they are with their lies, may lose the ability to distinguish between lies and truth. Fourth, lying creates an unfair advantage. Liars deceiving others will bring about an unfair advantage for the liar, or disadvantage for the dupe. And so that right there is a violation of the principle of justice. Self-destructiveness of lies is the fifth reason against lying. Once liars are found out, their words are no longer trusted, and the deceptions that the liars have kind of built tend to then fall apart. The liars lose any power or standing that they had, and lying can also undermine one's own self-image. Sixth, we have the effect of lying on society. So in addition to a breakdown in trust between interpersonal relationships, trust within a society, or from a society to a government or political leader, can also be damaged, so that the community as a whole suffers. Depending on how damaging the lie is, society itself may falter and collapse. We do, however, have some arguments for lying. The first is the defense of the innocent, including self-defense. So the idea here is that deceit and violence are two forms of assault, but if we can get out of a situation by lying, which is less harmful than violence, then perhaps we should lie instead of taking some other action that may cause a greater damage or hurt. And again, a lie may not be considered harmful when it actually is used to protect an innocent person. And one example that's frequently brought up kind of in support of lying would be if we were in kind of Nazi-occupied France, for example, during World War II, and some Nazi soldiers come and knock on your door and ask you if you have seen your neighbor who is Jewish. They've come by to kind of round up your Jewish neighbors. And you, in fact, know where your Jewish neighbor is. You have hidden her in your wine cellar. Here is a classic example when lying actually seems like the right thing to do. We would commend you if you lied to the Nazi soldier and said, no, I have no idea where my neighbor is, because by doing so, you would actually be protecting her and probably saving her life. A second argument for lying is national security. And again, for the same reasons as before, deceit and violence can be very harmful, and if we lie, we may be able to keep some secrets in order to protect our country or protect individuals. Third, we have trade secrets in business, and there are a number of reasons why we might be able to justifiably keep secrets or lie within a business environment. And we'll talk about some of those later on in the chapter about business ethics. And then we have what's called little white lies. And I think we have all told little white lies, and they're usually not very morally significant, about small things, and the odds of being found out about a little white lie are probably pretty low. So this is a situation where we might say, well, no harm, no foul. Lying didn't cause any harm, so it's acceptable to do it in that kind of situation. And then the author of our textbook gives us the moderate position on lying. And he says, of course, honesty is the best policy, And so we should approach every situation from a non-lying standpoint. But then if we are in a life-saving situation where a lie might save a life, then it's probably okay to lie. And so we may say honesty is the best policy, but lying is permissible in very serious matters. For the reasons given against lying, because of the domino effect and the fact that lying tends to break away at that the social veneer of trust. And so the consequences here, lying should be considered depending on each individual circumstance or situation. And lying may also be the best consequences. And when we look at stress, it's often stressful to tell the truth. When somebody asks you for your opinion, it might be nice to be able to soften kind of the blow of being brutally honest. And so the advocate of the moderate position on lying would say, look, one does not have to be brutally frank. Maybe we tell the truth gently, or reveal the truth a little bit at a time, or remove some of the worst facts about a situation. And so consider a police officer informing a family that their family member has been found murdered. And the parents and the family say, this is so devastating. Did my child suffer before they died? And the police officer might say, no, there's no evidence that they suffered before they died. And that might be a lie. There might be plenty of evidence to indicate that the victim suffered. But by lying and telling the family, no, the victim did not suffer before he died, that will kind of relieve the stress on the police officer, but also kind of bring some peace to the family members. So that's an example of maybe when lying would be permissible when it is not a life-saving issue. Of course, liars, if we're going to lie, liars should make sure that the consequences are at least harmless, if not beneficial, and that people should avoid habitual lying because of the domino effect. And liars must know that the lie has a harmful effect if the person deceived is ever learns that they've been deceived. People should not lie about important matters, and that lying is probably justifiable when there is no other option. Cheating. Since the act of cheating violates trust, it is considered a serious infraction in most moral systems. Of course, the author of our textbook brings us back to arguments for and against all four of these acts. But here, the arguments against cheating are that it's unfair and unjust. The cheater breaks the rules and deceives everybody, and cheating is a violation of justice and fairness, and it harms people who haven't cheated. If the rest of us are playing by the rules and you are cheating, then you've kind of trampled all over the rules of the game. A second argument is the falsified qualification. Cheating, say, to pass the bar exam, to become a lawyer in the state of California, might mean that you pass the exam because you've cheated, and that you're not actually qualified to be an attorney. And so it would put kind of your clients at risk, but it would also damage the value of the bar card for other attorneys who took the bar exam honestly, because once word gets out that there are some practicing attorneys who pass the bar who are not actually qualified to practice law because they passed only by cheating, that's going to raise doubts in clients' minds about whether their attorney is one who cheated their way through the bar exam or made it through honestly. And then next we have the effects on the cheater. Of course, cheaters hurt themselves in the long run. They're the subject of legal punishments. And again, if it becomes a habit, cheaters could become lazy. It weakens their morale, and of course, it breaks up vital relationships. But we have some arguments for cheating. Surviving and winning. Some people look at the world as if it's essentially dog eat dog. And so you need to do whatever it takes to survive and achieve. And so in this argument, winning takes precedence over any moral teaching. And sometimes we see cheating, especially in sports, because there's a lot riding on, say, winning the Super Bowl. And so someone might be tempted, or winning a gold medal at the Olympics, someone might be tempted to cheat. And partly they're tempted to cheat because of the second argument for cheating, which is everybody does it. If you've paid attention at all to Lance Armstrong cheating and doping scandal, a lot of other cyclists who were using steroids or blood doping said, look, but everybody's doing it. So if I don't cheat, then I'm not going to be able to participate in this sport because everybody else is also. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's right just because everybody's doing it, but that's how the argument goes. And then, of course, there are the consequences of getting caught. Being caught is the argument for cheating says, look, being caught is the bad here, not the cheating itself. And so the argument would say if there's a less or reduced chance of getting caught, then cheating would be more justifiable. If there's a higher chance of getting caught, then maybe we shouldn't cheat. Of course, the argument for cheating actually works pretty well with consequentialist theories because, again, we're focused on the consequences. And if there aren't going to be any bad consequences for you or other people, if you cheat, then a good utilitarian or a good consequentialist would say, then you should probably go ahead and cheat. All right, promise breaking. A promise that is entered into freely should be kept by the person who made such a promise. Oops, there we go. There's an implied agreement here. Breaking promises as a form of dishonesty. A person's word is an indication of that person's integrity and reputation. And the fact that we can rely on the promises we make allows us to live safely with each other in various groups. We assume that people will keep their promises, that people will stop at red lights and stop signs, that people won't harm each other. And having this promise allows us to move through the world safely and securely. And breaking a promise is a form of dishonesty. Essentially, it constitutes outright lying because you've agreed to do something and then you failed to do that. So essentially, when you agreed to do it, turns out you were lying. Now, a person's word a long time ago was tied closely to his or her reputation. In today's society, people often break their promises, and so we can't take people simply at their word. Now we need to get things in writing. We need to document agreements and promises. And of course, having a promise in writing does not guarantee that the promise will be kept, but at least it gives the promise holder some recourse in case the promiser breaks that promise. All right, let's turn to arguments against promise breaking. Of course, we have, just as with lying, the destruction of personal relationships, the domino theory. If we start breaking promises, it may become a habit or a way of life. Breaking promises has an effect on people's life choices, and the destruction of breaking promises can also lead to the destruction in general of societal trust. Again, Kant would say absolutely not. We cannot be breaking our promises because there's no way that would match up or be acceptable under the categorical imperative. And then, of course, the person who's breaking promises may also lose personal integrity. It leads to a loss of one's self-esteem and has an element or creates an element of guilt. And of course, most people cannot escape unscathed when we break promises. And so additionally, arguments for breaking promises, changed circumstances. And we have all encountered some situation here. So perhaps one can break a promise when it interferes with my own welfare. So if I promise to pick my brother up at the airport, but at the time his flight lands, there is a raging wildfire between my house and the airport, and kind of driving through that or driving on the freeway through that wildfire would put my own life at risk, it seems reasonable that I should be able to break my promise to my brother to pick him up at the airport. Perhaps we should be able to break promises when there are moral conflicts, such as protecting a life has precedence over keeping one's word. So if we're in a situation where we've made a promise, but if we break it, we're able to save someone's life, it seems like we might want to let us out of our original promise in order to free us up to save somebody else's life. Another argument for breaking promises is when the issue is trivial. So think of a small promise. Perhaps you promise to meet me at lunch at a cafe on campus, but you're reasonably confident that I will be able to find someone else with whom to have lunch if you break your promise. And so breaking the promise, it's a small thing, right? Whether I eat lunch alone or with you or with a colleague is really not a big deal. And so perhaps your promise to have lunch with me is really trivial. Another kind of argument for promise breaking is where unusual situations justify it. And one example here is if you promise to marry your best friend's brother because your best friend thinks the relationship would just be ideal, and your best friend is on her deathbed. So you agree to marry the brother in order to let the friend die kind of happily and with peace. But after your friend is dead, you don't marry her brother. You never really intended to. But it was so important to kind of let your friend pass peacefully that you agreed to it. That would be an example of an unusual situation where it might justify kind of making a promise or even lying and then breaking that promise later. And then one argument for promise breaking, which is a little cynical, but it says, look, no promise is sacred. Part of the risk you take in living in society and making promises is that the promises you make will be broken. And the burden is on the recipient or the promise holder to kind of be on the lookout and only make promises with people who are trustworthy. Next up, we have stealing. In the majority of societies and cultures, stealing is considered an immoral act. So we'll start with arguments against stealing. The first is property rights. Stealing involves taking someone else's property, and that's a violation of property rights. And property rights are important. It's important to believe that I have a right to the car that I'm currently making payments on. So for someone to steal that from me, that's a violation of my property right to that car. Secondly, we have a breakdown in trust, of course. Stealing severely breaks down the trust among people, and you can never trust a person who you suspect of stealing. And if you catch someone stealing from you, that relationship is probably destroyed. Next, we have an invasion of privacy. The thief violates the victim's privacy of their person or their home, and it will eventually interfere with the victim's life. And it may feel like kind of a compounded assault. So if someone steals your wallet and then later uses your credit card or steals your identity, that's kind of a double whammy where the victim there is really going to start to feel violated. Next up, we have the domino argument. That's the same one we've seen with the other kind of immoral acts. And then, of course, we have the effect on the thief. Stealing can affect their self-image and cause a bunch of guilt, and then also will cause others to lose respect for them. And we're not done unless we talk about some arguments for stealing. And the idea here, well, there are a number of ideas. One is the corruption of the economic system. People are entitled to steal and fulfill their basic needs. People steal to balance the inequities or perhaps cheat on their income taxes because they feel that they've been held down in their ability to make an honest living because of the economic system. That one's a little bit harder to swallow, but the next, the kind of crucial emergency situation. Here, one might say, look, we should be allowed to steal in situations when we don't have food. And so we might look differently at a young mother who steals a loaf of bread to feed her family than when we consider someone who's robbed a bank because he'd like to buy a yacht. There seems to be some difference there in whether the stealing is permissible, or rather how bad or how serious that offense is. We also have thrills and adventure. Stealing provides a thrill not obtainable in ordinary life, and life is short, so we should enjoy it. Again, I don't think that argument is going to get us very far. Another argument for stealing is specifically from certain institutions and organizations. Many people think that that stealing from certain organizations is justified. They argue that they have the right to take something because the organization is either too big to notice or care, or because that organization has done some wrong to them individually or to society. And so it's really a way of getting even with this big institution. And one more argument for stealing is that the consequences of getting caught in the act. Again, like we saw with cheating, the idea is that it's not that the stealing is wrong, it's that it's only wrong basically if you get caught. And of course, this person is who's advocating stealing if you don't get caught is not going to be acceptable to the non-consequentialists. In summary, we've talked about how lying, cheating, promise breaking, and stealing all violate the principles of individual freedom, truth-telling and honesty, justice and fairness, and goodness and rightness. These acts, these four acts, lying, cheating, promise breaking, and stealing, harm others while damaging the integrity of the offender. All right, that's it for this chapter.